Warleads, we know their legions, their tactics. They call us barbarians, but we will show them the strength of a Germania.
What if I told you that the greatest empire in human history was brought to its knees not by a great army, but by one grand lie? At the height of its power, the Roman Empire seemed like an indestructible machine, grinding down any people and territory in its path.
Close the gaps!
Rome's borders were expanding at an inexorable rate, and it seemed that the wild lands of Germany would soon become just another province with smooth roads and bathhouses. 3 elite legions, the best of the best, marched through the forest, confident in their complete safety and superiority over the barbarians. At the head of this procession stood a man who believed in the power of Roman law more than in the power of the sword, and this became his fatal mistake. None of the 20,000 men who entered the shade of the ancient trees suspected that this march would be the funeral of Rome's dream of world domination. Watch the video to the end to find out how one man managed to deceive an entire empire and why, after those 3 days, Rome refused to cross the Rhine ever again. Are you ready to learn the truth about why the best army in the world behaved so carelessly? Quinctilius Varus, governor of Germania, viewed these lands not as a frontier, but as already conquered territory where Roman peace reigned. He was an experienced administrator, accustomed to governing submissive provinces such as Syria, and he applied this experience to the turbulent tribes of the north. Varus led his legions not in battle formation, but as if on a ceremonial parade or a move to a summer residence. In this huge column, stretching for kilometers, soldiers mingled with civilians, carts, and servants. This created the illusion of peace, as if they were not in a wild land, but in a calm and completely subjugated area, similar to the long-established regions of the empire. This attitude toward the campaign created an atmosphere of relaxation that was completely inappropriate for a place where every bush could hide an enemy. The Romans carried a huge amount of luggage with them, completely inappropriate for a military expedition in wild lands. The carts were loaded with expensive furniture, tableware, supplies of fine wine, and clothing necessary for the governor to live comfortably. These things were a manifestation of the Roman elite's habit of surrounding themselves with luxury even far from the capital. The officers did not ride on war horses, but in carriages, discussing the latest news from the capital or career prospects, as if they were on a routine inspection trip. The discipline for which the legions were famous weakened under the influence of a false sense of complete security. Soldiers did not wear armor, weapons lay in the baggage train, and shields hung on the sides of the carts. This made them virtually defenseless against a sudden attack. The absence of alarm became the norm, and no one thought that the situation could change in an instant. Varus sincerely trusted those around him, especially the young Germanic prince Arminius, who had grown up in Rome and had the status of a knight. Arminius was a frequent guest at the governor's banquets, ate with him at the same table, and spoke flawless Latin. Such trust seemed natural, since the prince had received a Roman education and served in the army. The Romans believed that the process of civilizing the barbarians was proceeding successfully and irreversibly, that the Germanic chiefs were accepting Roman customs and way of life. No one paid attention to the warnings of other Germanic leaders who tried to open Varus's eyes to the conspiracy that was brewing. These reports only irritated the governor, who considered them an attempt to sow discord. Any information about a rebellion was perceived as slander by envious people against a loyal friend of Rome. This blindness of hope proved fatal, as Varus failed to see that behind the outward loyalty lay a carefully prepared betrayal. The very nature of the terrain seemed to the Romans to be merely a temporary inconvenience, not a mortal threat. They were accustomed to building roads through mountains and bridges over the most turbulent rivers, so the forests of Germany seemed to them to be a normal obstacle, not particularly difficult to overcome. The forest was perceived as a source of timber, not as a complex tactical environment requiring special attention. But the local tribes knew every ravine and every trail, and could use the terrain in ways the Romans could not. Engineers walked ahead, lazily clearing the way for the governor's cumbersome carts, as if they were creating a path for a peaceful procession rather than an army. The pace was extremely slow, but no one was in a hurry, because warm winter quarters awaited them ahead. This calm only reinforced the complacency of the commanders, who saw no signs of danger. The column stretched out so far that the head of the detachment did not know what was happening at the rear. This violated all the principles of troop management, as legions always acted in close coordination. Communication between units was poor, orders were transmitted with delays, creating chaos in the movement. The legionnaires marched at a relaxed pace, talking and joking as if they were on a walk in Italy, not in the heart of unconquered lands. They did not send out long-range reconnaissance, relying on information provided by their German allies, who were already involved in preparing the ambush at that moment. This was an army that had forgotten it was in hostile territory and failed to see the threat where it was strongest. Such carelessness made them easy prey. Var ignored the basic principles of campaign security, believing that his authority was sufficient to contain any unrest. He treated the Germans as future taxpayers who would soon fully accept Roman order, rather than as tribes ready to take up arms. He saw them only as subjects, not as warriors capable of challenging the eagle. This arrogant blindness spread from the commander to the soldiers, lulling them into complacency at every turn. Every step deeper into the forest took them further away from their supply and support bases, turning the campaign into a risky journey. The Roman war machine had been dismantled and packed into boxes, becoming useless baggage that only hindered the army's movement and ability to respond to threats. Everything that had once made the legions invincible disappeared in this confusion. Women and merchants walked among the carts, making maneuvering even more difficult and turning the army into a camp. This created an atmosphere of peaceful life, completely inappropriate in the wild forest, where every step could lead to an attack. The caravan moved slowly, sometimes stopping due to broken carts, which stretched the column even further. Any attempt to quickly reorganize into battle formation would have been doomed to failure due to the accumulation of carts. The legionnaires were burdened with personal belongings that they did not want to abandon, as they believed there was no danger. Their sense of invulnerability played a cruel joke on them, disabling their instinct for self-preservation and leaving them defenseless against a sudden attack. All this created the perfect conditions for the coming disaster. History knows few examples of such blatant carelessness on the part of an experienced commander. Varus disregarded all the rules written in the blood of previous generations of Roman soldiers and ignored the lessons of the numerous wars fought by the Republic and then the Empire. He created the ideal conditions for his army to be destroyed, and he did it with his own hands. The most surprising thing is that he had the opportunity to turn back or choose another, safer route if he had listened to at least some of the warnings. But he trusted the one who had already signed his death warrant and failed to notice the obvious threat. Thus, his overconfidence led to one of the most terrible military disasters in the history of Rome. I am very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about the Roman command's overconfidence, which bordered on stupidity? Write about it in the comments, and be sure to subscribe to the channel to see more historical analyses. Want to know a secret that will change your life if you find yourself in the forest? The weather in Germany can change in a matter of hours, turning solid ground into impassable swamp. As the huge Roman column drew into the thicket of the Teutoburg Forest, the sky was covered with leaden clouds. A cold, endless downpour began, immediately washing away the dirt roads. Heavy carts began to sink into the mud, breaking axles and wheels and creating traffic jams. The ground beneath the feet of thousands of people and animals turned into slippery slush that was impossible to stand on. Legionnaires wearing spiked caligae slipped and fell, losing their formation and orientation. Mud stuck to their shoes, clothes, and equipment, making every step a painful ordeal. Moisture penetrated everywhere, causing the wood of the shields to swell and become heavy. The bowstrings and torsion machines became wet and lost their elasticity, rendering them useless. The forest around them grew denser, the trees encroaching on the road itself, creating a green corridor with no way out. Huge oaks and beeches closed their crowns overhead, creating eternal twilight even during the daytime. Branches lashed at their faces, and tree roots seemed to deliberately cling to the legs of those walking. Visibility was reduced to a few dozen meters, hiding what lurked in the thicket. The narrow path did not allow for the deployment of the wide Roman formations that had been the key to their victories on the plains. The legions were forced to stretch out into a thin line, vulnerable to attack from any side. The flanks were left unprotected, as the cavalry could not operate effectively in the thick undergrowth. The soldiers found themselves trapped between the carts and the wall of the forest, unable to maneuver. They felt like hunted animals, even though the enemy was not yet in sight. The wind picked up, tearing off branches and drowning out all sounds except the noise of rain and the creaking of trees. The centurion's commands were lost in this natural roar, disrupting the command of the troops. The men began to freeze in their wet tunics, which reduced their physical endurance and morale. Nature itself seemed to have risen up against the invaders, creating ideal conditions for those who lived here. It was no longer just a march, but a struggle against the elements themselves. At that moment, the German guides, who were supposed to show the way, began to disappear one by one. They dissolved into the fog and rain, leaving the Romans alone in unfamiliar territory. The road they were being led along became increasingly worse, leading into the most impassable wilderness. Marshes and ravines blocked the way, forcing the column to stop and look for detours. Chaos grew, and with it anxiety among the ordinary soldiers. The Romans began cutting down trees to widen the passage and strengthen the ground beneath the wheels of their carts. It was exhausting work, sapping the last reserves of strength from men unaccustomed to the labor of lumberjacks. The sound of axes echoed far through the forest, revealing the column's location to any observer. The soldiers struggled to pull the stuck carts out of the muddy trap. Var still hoped that these were only temporary difficulties and that the forest would soon end. But the forest did not end. It only became darker and more hostile with every kilometer. Huge trunks of fallen trees blocked the way, and it seemed that they had not fallen by accident. The Romans found themselves in a labyrinth from which there was no way back. They had entered a death zone prepared for them by nature itself and a cunning enemy. The feeling that thousands of eyes were watching them became physically palpable. The elements deprived the Romans of their main advantage, the organization and discipline of their formation. Each soldier was left alone with the forest, rain, and mud. It was no longer an army, but a crowd of armed men wandering through the storm. And it was at this moment, when they were at their weakest, that the trap finally snapped shut. Are you ready to find out what role nature played in this, becoming an ally of the barbarians? Would you be able to remain calm when nature itself is trying to kill you? In the next chapter, you will learn how the emperor's best friend stabbed him in the back. What if I told you that everything you believed in was a lie, and your best friend was your executioner? Arminius, who was riding alongside Varus, suddenly asked permission to leave to gather additional Germanic auxiliary troops. He convinced the governor that these fresh forces would help restore order and clear the way. Varus, blinded by trust, let him go, not even suspecting that he was seeing Arminius for the last time as an ally. Other Germanic chiefs who made up the Roman army's escort and reconnaissance also left with him. As soon as the horsemen disappeared into the forest, the mask of loyalty was instantly discarded. Arminius did not go to gather help for Rome. He went to lead an army of destruction. He united the scattered tribes, the Cherusci, Marsi, Chatti, and Bructeri, with a common goal and hatred of the occupiers. His knowledge of Roman tactics, gained during years of service in the legions, now became his main weapon against his former teachers. He knew all the weaknesses of the Romans, their signals, command structure, and psychology. The auxiliary Germanic troops marching within the Roman column suddenly turned their weapons against their commanders. It happened quietly and swiftly. Those who had been comrades a second ago slit the throats of the Romans. Panic began to spread from within, as no one understood who was friend and who was foe. The betrayal was total and carefully planned in advance. The Germans who served Rome had in fact been waiting all this time for Arminius' signal. Arminius used his position to lead the Romans into this narrow isthmus between the hill and the swamp. He knew every ravine and every path in this forest because it was his home. He turned geography into a weapon, choosing the perfect place for an ambush, where the numerical superiority of the Romans would become their disadvantage. His plan was not just to win the battle, but to completely destroy the legions, not letting anyone escape. At first, the Romans found Arminius' disappearance strange, but not catastrophic. They expected him to return with reinforcements and solve their problems with the local guides. The realization that their loyal friend was in fact the architect of their demise came slowly and painfully. It was a betrayal of such magnitude that it was beyond the comprehension of the Roman aristocrat. Varus refused to believe the reports that the Germans were attacking the supply train until the very last moment. Arminius acted coolly, using Roman standards and signal horns to mislead the legionaries. He knew how to sow chaos by giving contradictory orders or imitating the arrival of reinforcements. His warriors emerged from the fog wearing Roman armor captured earlier, further confusing the legionaries. It was a psychological attack aimed at destroying trust within the Roman army itself. Arminius' personality was key to the success of the entire uprising, as only he could unite the eternally warring tribes. He convinced the chiefs that the invincible Rome could be broken if struck in the right place at the right time. His charisma and knowledge of the enemy made the impossible possible. They united Germany. He became a bridge between two worlds, which he burned down along with the Roman legions. For Varus, this betrayal was a personal collapse of all his beliefs and career. He realized that his soft policy and trust in the noble barbarians had led to disaster. The blow was struck not just in the back, but in the very heart of the Roman system of provincial administration. Arminius proved that Rome was not all-powerful and could be outmaneuvered on its own turf. The story of Arminius is a classic example of a double agent who patiently waited for his moment for years. He played the role of the perfect Roman, hiding in his heart a flame of vengeance for his people. His actions changed the map of Europe for the next 2,000 years. Like this if you are impressed by the cunning and patience of Arminius, who managed to deceive an entire empire. Guess what happened next when the first arrows flew out of the green wall of the forest? The attack began not with a battle cry and a frontal assault, but with a silent death falling from the sky. The Germans rained a hail of spears and stones on the stretched-out column, remaining invisible behind trees and bushes. The Romans fell, pierced by projectiles, without even understanding where the threat came from. The shields hanging on the carts were inaccessible, and the armor lay in bundles. The barbarians used hit-and-run tactics, attacking individual groups of Romans and instantly disappearing into the forest. They attacked where the Romans were most vulnerable, in areas where carts and civilians were concentrated. The cries of the wounded and the panic of the animals mingled in a terrifying cacophony. Horses, maddened by pain and fear, broke their harnesses and trampled their own soldiers. Chaos engulfed the column, and control of the troops was lost in the first few minutes. The Romans tried to form a battle line, but the dense trees prevented them from closing ranks and creating a wall of shields. The legionaries found themselves isolated from each other, forced to fight alone against several opponents. The Germans, armed with light frame-eye spears, were more mobile and better suited to fighting in the forest. They knew every bump and used the terrain to launch surprise attacks from the flanks and rear. The rain continued to pour down, turning the ground beneath their feet into a quagmire in which the Romans sank under the weight of their equipment. Those who managed to put on their armor quickly became exhausted, sinking knee-deep into the mud. The enemies, dressed lightly and familiar with the trails, moved quickly and confidently. It was like a pack of nimble predators beating a clumsy giant. Every bush and every tree seemed like a deadly danger to the Romans. The commanders tried to organize a defense, gathering small groups of soldiers around them. But these pockets of resistance were quickly overwhelmed by waves of attacking barbarians. The centurions were the first to die, as the crests on their helmets made excellent targets. Without their commanders, the soldiers lost their will to resist and huddled together, becoming easy prey. The Germans deliberately targeted horses and mules to completely stop the movement of the column. The carcasses of dead animals blocked the road, creating traffic jams and congestion. The Romans found themselves trapped, unable to move forward or backward. They were squeezed into a narrow corridor of death, shot at from all sides. Fear paralyzed many who had recently considered themselves masters of the world. The sight of ferocious barbarians emerging from the fog instilled terror in the soldiers, who had been pampered by garrison duty. Rumors that they had been betrayed by their own guides completely undermined their morale. People began to abandon their valuables and luggage, trying to save only their lives. The barbarians took no prisoners in the first hours of the battle. Their goal was to destroy as many living forces as possible. They finished off the wounded without wasting time on pity or negotiations. Blood mixed with rainwater and mud, staining the forest streams red. It was a massacre the Roman army had not seen in several generations. The first day of the battle showed the complete helplessness of classical Roman tactics in the conditions of guerrilla warfare in the forest. Legions, created for open battles, proved powerless against an invisible enemy. The illusion of invincibility vanished with the first fog. Do you think the Romans had even a single chance to turn the tide of battle in such conditions? In the next chapter, we will learn about an attempt to build a fortress in the middle of hell. With the onset of darkness, the Germanic attacks weakened, but did not cease completely, turning into disturbing raids. They acted covertly, appearing from the shadows and disappearing just as quickly, leaving behind only fear and tension. The Romans managed to somehow get out into a relatively open space and begin building a camp, hoping for at least a temporary respite. It was no longer the ideal rectangle with straight streets that they usually built. Following the strict instructions of the Roman army, it was a hastily erected fortification, surrounded by a rampart and a moat dug by exhausted people who could barely stand on their feet from fatigue. The soldiers worked in complete darkness and silence, afraid of attracting the enemy's attention and realizing that any flash of light could be a death sentence for them. Inside the camp, there was an oppressive atmosphere of doom and fear of the inevitable end. Everyone understood that this was only a brief respite, after which the attacks would resume. The wounded moaned, unable to receive proper care, as many medicines had been lost in the convoy or were simply unavailable. Even experienced military medics could do nothing but bandage wounds with dirty rags. They tried not to light fires or made them small so as not to reveal their positions and expose how weakened the legions were. People huddled together, trying to keep warm and find some comfort in the presence of their comrades, as the frost and dampness made the night even more difficult. There was little food, as most of the provisions had been left behind in abandoned or looted wagons, and hunger only intensified the feeling of impending doom. Var gathered a military council in his tent, but none of the officers could come up with a rescue plan. The commanders' faces were grey with fatigue, and their eyes were full of despair, because everyone understood. They were deep behind enemy lines, cut off from any help. All the maps, plans, and calculations that had guided them earlier lost their meaning after the first day of the massacre. It was decided to burn the extra carts and destroy anything that could slow them down in order to try to at least maintain their maneuverability. It was an act of desperation, an admission that the expedition had failed and that now it was only a matter of survival, not of carrying out any orders. The glow of the burning carts illuminated the faces of the legionnaires, distorted with horror, who looked at the flames as a symbol of the end of their hopes. The night was filled with the sounds of enemy signal horns and the cries of the Germans celebrating their first victory and anticipating the next. These sounds weighed heavily on the psyche, preventing anyone from closing their eyes and resting before the new day, turning the night into an endless nightmare. The Romans understood that they were surrounded by thousands of enemies who were just waiting for dawn to finish what they had started and finish off the remnants of the legions. Every rustle behind the rampart made them grab their weapons with trembling hands, and their hearts slowed down in anticipation of the blow. Even the bravest veterans admitted that they had never experienced such horror before, for the enemy was close but invisible. In the morning, the legions, significantly depleted and deprived of their baggage train, left the camp, trying to break through to open ground where they could at least form a proper battle order. Var ordered them to move in as tight a formation as possible to protect their flanks and avoid a repeat of the chaos of the first day. However, the terrain again worked against them, forcing them into the forest, where any advantage of discipline disappeared in the blink of an eye. Rain and mud turned the ground into a trap, slowing their movement and breaking their formation. The hope that the Germans had had their fill of loot and would leave faded with every step, as the first sounds in the thicket made it clear that the enemy was only preparing for the next strike. What if I showed you a time machine that would take us to the deadliest point on the route? On the second and third days, the Romans' path lay through a narrow strip of land between the steep hill of Kalkreis and a vast impassable swamp. It was a bottleneck where thousands of people had to pass along a path only a few dozen meters wide. It was here that Arminius prepared his main trap, turning the area into a shooting gallery. The Germanic tribes had built a long earthen rampart on the hillside in advance, camouflaged with vegetation. This fortification allowed them to attack the Romans from above while remaining relatively safe. The wall had special passages for quick sorties and retreats back under the protection of the fortification. This came as a complete surprise to the Romans. They were confronted with an engineered position of the barbarians. When the column entered the passage, a barrage of javelins, stones, and arrows rained down on them from the rampart. The Romans could not attack the wall because the slope was steep and slippery with mud. They could not retreat in the other direction because there was a boggy swamp waiting for them. They found themselves trapped in a corridor of death, where every step cost a life. The Germans made daring sorties, running downhill, striking blows, and instantly returning behind the wall. The Romans tried to storm the rampart, but these attempts were scattered and chaotic. The heavy infantry slipped on the slope, becoming easy targets for the defenders of the fortification. The bodies of the slain Romans began to pile up, hindering the movement of the living. The crush in the narrow passage reached monstrous proportions, with people trampling each other in panic. The cavalry, trying to break through, knocked down their own infantrymen. The formation finally fell apart, turning into an uncontrollable mass of people. The cries of the commanders were drowned out by the general noise of battle and the screams of the dying. Archaeological excavations at this site confirm the picture of complete destruction. The coins, pieces of ammunition, and bones found here lie exactly as they fell 2,000 years ago. The earth here is literally saturated with iron and death. The Kalkreis rampart became a tombstone for 3 legions. Seeing the helplessness of their enemy, the Germans became bolder, descending into the lowlands for hand-to-hand combat. They used long spears to strike the Romans without entering the range of their short swords. Roman shields, weighed down by moisture, no longer protected against powerful blows. The legionnaires' strength was waning, and their enemies seemed to be growing in number. It was a methodical slaughter of an army that could not fight back. The Roman war machine, designed for conventional battles, broke down against a wall of turf and mud. Arminius proved that knowledge of the terrain was more important than numbers and discipline. Never before had the Roman army found itself in such a hopeless situation. Every meter of the way through this defile was paid for with hundreds of lives. There was no longer any hope of a breakthrough. Why do you think the Romans were unable to use their famous siege skills to destroy the wall? In the next chapter, you will learn about the tragic end of the Roman command. By the end of the third day, it was clear that there was no hope of rescue, and a breakthrough was impossible. The Roman legions, once the pride of the empire, had been reduced to scattered groups of exhausted men, surrounded on all sides. The rain and wind continued unabated, as if nature itself were mourning the fall of Rome. Weapons fell from weakened hands, and armor became an unbearable burden, dragging them to the ground. Quinctilius Varus, realizing the gravity of his guilt and the hopelessness of the situation, made a decision traditional for a Roman officer. He could not allow himself to be captured by the barbarians and become a plaything in their hands. Following the example of his father and grandfather, he committed suicide by throwing himself on his sword. He was followed by the senior officers of the headquarters, who preferred death to dishonor. The suicide of the command completely demoralized the remaining troops. Seeing that their leaders were dead, the soldiers lost their last will to resist. Some followed the example of their commanders, while others simply gave up, waiting for the blow. Uncontrollable panic and surrender began, although there was no mercy to be expected. The Germans captured the most valuable thing the legion had, the legionary eagles, aquilae. These golden standards were sacred symbols of Roman power and the soul of the legion. Their loss was considered the greatest disgrace, which could not be washed away by anything but blood. The barbarians tore off their decorations and raised them as trophies, demonstrating their complete victory. The massacre reached its climax, turning into the total extermination of all living things. The Germans spared no one, neither officers nor ordinary soldiers nor servants. The forest was littered with bodies lying in layers of mud and blood. The prisoners who were taken were sacrificed to the gods in sacred groves, hanged from trees, or drowned in swamps. Only tiny groups of cavalry managed to break out of the encirclement and flee to the Rhine. They brought news of the catastrophe that shook the entire Roman world. Most of them remained in the Teutoburg Forest forever, deprived even of the right to burial. Their bones lay white among the trees for many years, serving as a frightening reminder of the power of the barbarians. This was the end of the 17th, 18th, and 19th legions. Their numbers were permanently removed from the Roman army's lists and never used again. Rome recognized that these units were not simply defeated, but wiped out of existence. The great illusion that Rome was eternal and invincible collapsed into the mud of the Germanic forests. 6 years later, when the Roman army under Germanicus returned to these places, they saw a blood-curdling sight. The forest still bore traces of that terrible battle, as if time had stopped here. The tree branches were still broken, the ground was scarred by old trenches, and the paths were overgrown, but they still bore traces of a desperate flight and pursuit. The forest had become a giant open-air cemetery, where nature was slowly, but not completely, erasing the memory of the tragedy. Everywhere lay the bleached bones of men and horses, some in piles, some scattered, as if death had overtaken them suddenly and without mercy. Even those who had served in the army for many years trembled at the sight of these silent testimonies of defeat. The Romans found the remains of Varus's camp, the half-ruined rampart of the Germans, and the sites of the final battles, where the earth was blacker and denser, as if saturated with blood. The remains of carts, broken weapons, and bent spearheads were reminders of the chaotic, desperate battle. The skulls of Roman centurions hung from the trees, nailed there by the barbarians as gruesome trophies, preserved despite the passage of time. These terrifying decorations of the sacred groves showed how deep the Germans' hatred for Rome was. Altars were found in the sacred groves, where the Germans sacrificed captured tribunes and centurions of the first ranks. performing rituals that mixed faith, fear, and cruelty. This sight brought tears and rage to the hardened veterans of Germanicus, for they saw not only the death of their comrades, but a deliberate insult to Roman honor. The soldiers began to gather the bones of their fallen comrades to bury them with due honors. They walked through the forest for hours, placing the remains in specially brought baskets and cloths, doing so with such care as if they were afraid of disturbing the peace of the dead. No one could identify who the remains belonged to, soldier or officer, legionnaire or freedman. All were equal in the face of death and time. This was the first and only mass burial on the battlefield performed by the Romans themselves, a gesture of mourning that Rome did not perform on any other battlefield. For the first time in a long time, Rome buried not enemies, but an entire army of its sons, lost far from their homeland and left to lie at the mercy of the elements. What they saw forever changed the psychology of Roman soldiers on the Germanic frontier. They understood that beyond the Rhine lived an enemy that could not be underestimated and was capable of extreme cruelty, comparable only to a desperate struggle for freedom. The forest ceased to be just a landscape. It became a symbol of fear and death, a place where no one wanted to return without necessity. Legends that the Germanic forests were full of spirits and shadows of fallen legionnaires spread among the troops faster than official reports. The myth that civilization always triumphs over savagery was dispelled by the sight of these bones, for it was not discipline and order that prevailed here, but knowledge of the terrain and fierce resistance. Germanicus's expedition was more an act of revenge and mourning than an attempt to regain territories that were already considered too dangerous for further campaigns. The Romans were able to recapture 2 of the 3 lost eagles, which somewhat restored the empire's honor and signaled that the memory of the fallen would be preserved. This was an important event, as the loss of the eagles had been considered the greatest disgrace for many years. But it was impossible to bring back the dead and erase the horror of Teutoburg from memory. Even decades later, this forest remained a wound that Rome could never completely heal. The consequences of the battle in the Teutoburg Forest went far beyond military history. The Roman Empire, which until then had known no limits to its expansion, suddenly stopped, as if it had stumbled upon an invisible wall. Plans to create a large province of Germania stretching from the Rhine to the Elbe were abandoned and forgotten, even though they had recently been considered an inevitable step in strengthening imperial power. The Rhine became not just a river, but a rigid border between 2 worlds, Roman and Germanic, dividing Europe into spheres of influence for many centuries. This border became a symbol of fears and expectations, for beyond it lay lands that Rome no longer attempted to subjugate. Emperor Tiberius, Augustus's successor, made a strategic decision to abandon further conquests in the north. He realized that the cost of holding these lands was too high, and the benefits were questionable, especially after the extent of the losses became clear. Rome switched to a defensive strategy, building limes and fortifications along the river, turning them into a continuous line of control and surveillance. Instead of an offensive, watchtowers, fortresses, and garrisons appeared, designed to track the movements of tribes beyond the Rhine. Germany remained free, preserving its language, culture, and social structure, which were so far removed from Roman ideas that the integration of these lands became virtually impossible. This decision determined the fate of Europe for millennia to come. If Rome had conquered Germany, modern Europe would look completely different, because Roman culture and the Latin language would have spread northward, no less than in Gaul or Spain. The languages spoken today by Germans, English, and Scandinavians could have disappeared, giving way to Latin, and with them, the cultural traditions associated with the ancient Germanic world would have disappeared. The cultural divide between the Roman south and the Germanic north originated in the Teutoburg Forest, where Rome first recognized that there were boundaries that could not be crossed by force. This divide determined the development of Europe in both the Middle Ages and the modern era, shaping different models of society in the north and south. The battle showed that the Roman military machine had its limits. It was effective where there were roads, cities, and open spaces, but it faltered in wild forests and swamps, where the enemy knew every corner of the terrain. The Romans were accustomed to winning through organization, discipline, and engineering prowess. But in the Teutoburg Forest, all these advantages proved useless. It was a lesson in geography for which Rome paid with 3 legions, losing not only men but also confidence in its own infallible power. The empire moved from a phase of endless expansion to a phase of preserving what it had achieved, trying to consolidate its borders rather than expand them. This change was a turning point in its history, as it gradually changed the way Roman rulers thought. The Germanic tribes, realizing their strength, became a constant threat to Rome for centuries to come. Arminius's victory gave them a sense of national identity and the belief that they could stand up to their great neighbor, even if they did not have a unified state. They saw that the Roman legions were not all-powerful, and this confidence was passed down from generation to generation, becoming the foundation of their political culture. This spirit of resistance would ultimately lead to the fall of Rome itself 400 years later, when new waves of Germanic peoples crossed the borders and destroyed the western part of the empire. Thus, a single battle in a wild forest became the starting point for processes that changed the entire course of European history. When news of the defeat reached Rome, the city was plunged into mourning and panic. Emperor Augustus, who had ruled for several decades and seen many victories, was devastated by the news. This was a man who had lived through civil wars, seen the demise of republics and the birth of an empire, but even he was unprepared for a blow of such force. It is said that he did not cut his hair or shave for several months as a sign of mourning, as if he wanted to physically show how deeply the wound had cut into his soul. He often banged his head against the doorframe, repeating the same phrase, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions." These words later became famous because they reflected the horror and disbelief of the entire Roman society in the face of an irreparable loss. This cry of despair from the most powerful man in the world became a symbol of powerlessness in the face of disaster. Augustus understood that it was not just soldiers who had been lost, but the elite of the army, which could not be quickly restored, because the 3 legions included the most experienced and hardened warriors. Along with them, commanders, engineers, and legionary standards were lost, and with them, the prestige of Rome. He disbanded his personal bodyguard unit, which was made up of Germans, fearing betrayal in the heart of Rome, because now trust in the northern tribes was completely gone. The city lived in fear of a possible barbarian invasion of Italy, and many residents expected the Germans to take advantage of the empire's weakness. These fears were compounded by anxiety, as no one knew where the border of safety now lay. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest remained in Roman memory as Clades Variana, the defeat of Varus. It was a black mark on the empire's reputation, which they tried not to mention unnecessarily, so as not to remind people of their weakness in the face of the barbarians. However, it also served as an important lesson that formed the basis of further Roman policy in northern Europe. Rome never again trusted the barbarians as blindly as Varus trusted Arminius, and from then on, the Germanic tribes were seen not as future citizens, but as dangerous neighbors requiring constant surveillance. The legionaries who went north long remembered the fate of their fallen comrades, which influenced the entire strategy of future campaigns. Arminius became a hero to his people, but his fate was also tragic. He was killed by his own relatives, who feared his power. After his victory, his influence grew, and many saw him as a potential king, which contradicted Germanic traditions based on collective decision-making. But his cause outlived him, because the tribes of Germany continued to resist Roman pressure, preserving their independence and way of life. Germany never became Roman, despite numerous attempts by the empire to regain what it had lost. history judged them harshly. Varus is remembered as a symbol of carelessness, and Arminius as a symbol of cunning and the struggle for freedom, although both were, in a sense, hostages to circumstances. This event reminds us that even the greatest empires are vulnerable if they lose touch with reality. 3 days in the forest rewrote the history of the continent, changing Rome's strategic plans and halting its advance into Europe. Those days became a turning point that showed that there were limits to imperial power after all. The echoes of those events can still be heard today in the cultural and linguistic diversity of Europe. For if Rome had completed its conquest of the Germanic lands, the map of the continent would have been very different. But Varus's defeat preserved the space where future European nations were formed, and thus had an imperceptible influence on the future of Western civilization as a whole. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest is not just an episode in military history, it is a turning point in the fate of Western civilization as a whole. An ambush organized by one man destroyed the illusion of Roman invincibility, and drew a line that Rome never dared to cross. We saw how arrogance and underestimation of the enemy can lead to disaster, even if you have the best army in the world. The story of Varus and Arminius teaches us that betrayal often comes under the guise of friendship, and that nature can be a more formidable enemy than any warrior. What do you think was the main reason for the Romans' defeat? Arminius's genius or Varus's stupidity? Would you like to see an analysis of other great ambushes in history? Write your suggestions in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new dives into the past.